My name is Corrigan, and I'm in the Cinema Studies program here at Penn. And it is a great honor and pleasure to bring Ross McElwee and his film to Penn today. I think most of us know already that we're talking about one of the most important documentary filmmakers working in the world today, and one of the most innovative documentary filmmakers working in the world today. I assume many of you know his personal history and his filmography with films such as Sherman's March, which is one of the great films, I think, in American film history, and which has appropriately been chosen for the preservation by the Library of Congress National Film Registry. But after that, we have quite a few other, I think, really astonishing and really important films, from 6 O'Clock News to Bright Leaves, which is one of my favorite films of all times. Ross has won numerous awards. He's shown films around the world, everywhere from Amsterdam to Wellington, and most of the major capitals and most of the major film festivals he's been honored at. He's been rewarded with numerous acknowledgments, such as the Rockefeller Award, the National Endowment of the Arts Award, an American Film Institute grant, a Guggenheim, and one could go on and on. Currently, he is at Harvard University, where he's taught since 1986. I personally have been enormously influenced by his films from the very beginning, from 1986, Sherman's March, through Bright Leaves, and other films as well. He's considered, I think, appropriately part of what I would consider the most important renaissance in documentary filmmaking since the 1930s. A virtual revolution in documentary filmmaking over the past few decades, which has expanded to include numerous filmmakers operating in very different ways across the documentary format, to the extent that I'm not even sure the term documentary filmmaking is appropriate anymore. That one often sees these films characterized as personal documentaries, meta-documentaries, experimental documentaries, and so forth. And my personal favorite, which was inspired in many ways by Ross's films, is the essay film, which I have worked on for a while, and certainly includes numerous films that Ross has made along the way. This is, in many ways, a kind of personal homecoming as well, which I think is appropriate. For those of you that know his films, one of the things that's most magnificent about them is the way they layer so much personal history, public history, reflections on time, family, the past, and identity, and so forth. And it's, in some ways, fortuitous, I suppose, serendipitous, that Ross is coming back now, because in the 8 years since we've had a cinema studies program at Penn, Ross was the first speaker we brought in 2004 to come. And so we will characterize him as our inspiration. So in a sense, I see him as finally coming home to the program that he helped to, in some ways, inspire and move ahead. So with that, please welcome Ross McElwee.
Everybody hear me? I guess I don't really need this, do I? Tim, thank you so much. It's incredibly, I mean, I don't know how I can live up to that ever. And Tim has written a magnificent book about essay films, not just my films. I mean, the whole concept of essay, starting with Michel Montaigne all the way through Michael Moore, as including my work and a number of other filmmakers who are fortunate enough to have you writing about them. So, at the risk of too much backslapping, it's really a wonderful book, and I'm just thrilled that I've made some contribution to helping this program get off the ground. I wasn't even aware that it had a part, but I'm glad to hear that. And, here I am back home in 2008, for 8 years later, and it's a pleasure to be here. I won't say a lot about this film, except it is a kind of continuation of my autobiographical essay film work. its premise is that I had filmed various aspects of my personal life and my family life over the years, and now sort of over the years, a generation change has come. My son is now almost an adult, and it's the almost that is the problem. And it's described, I think, pretty pointedly in this film, as you'll see. I don't want to say a lot more about it than that, except for those of you who speak decent French, I give you my apologies in advance, because you'll have to suffer through my version of the French language throughout this. But we will have a discussion afterwards, and again, thank you very much for coming. I hope you enjoyed the film.
We have time for questions, so I'm going to invite Russ back up here to respond to your questions.
Well, I do talk a lot throughout this film, so I have nothing more to say. But I'm happy to try to answer the questions that you might have. Yes?
I was curious, you mentioned in the film that you also were distractible like your son. And I'm curious, you've obviously accomplished a lot and completed a lot of projects. I'm curious, what were things that you found helpful in kind of finding a way to completing things and to having completed output?
Are you an ADD victim?
Same.
Solidarity, brother. I think part of it is a matter of maturation, like your body catches up with your mind in a way, where something happens. I don't know when I finally realized, I'm going to look at my notebooks now and I think, this person was crazy. These notes, and they're not even written linearly, they're written in geometric blocks, spacing different dimensions, and they make no sense now. And I think at some point, one of the reasons I chose filmmaking is you have to deal with the footage that you gather. And it forces you, especially in cinema verite documentary filmmaking, where you're not scripting, you're not interviewing, there's no real preparation. You basically, but that style of filmmaking immediately appealed to me once I adapted it for myself, because it forced me to deal with whatever footage I came home with. And then I had to fashion from that some kind of narrative that made sense to other people, not just to me. It's no longer a private journal. This is something I could accept. I had to present to the world. So I think for those reasons, for me, this form of essay documentary filmmaking provided the kind of structure that I needed. And I flourished, well, you can call it flourishing, I'm not getting rich, but it gave me a direction and a way to accomplish something that I did not have before. I tried writing. I would write hundreds, if not thousands of pages of so-called fiction, and it just kept bifurcating and going off into other possibilities, other narrative strands, and I could never get it to coalesce. I didn't have the focus to make that happen. I had the discipline, I spent hours, but it just... And so when I see my son spending, 10, 12 hours in front of a computer screen trying to accomplish something, I'm totally supportive, but then I gently ask at the end of the week, so, what do you think you got done this week? I'm just curious and no pressure. And often it's nothing. You look at the skeleton of a website that has been designing, but it's not finished. And I so know what he's going through, and I'm so sympathetic, but I know that period is very, very difficult. So I think it's a matter of just finding that something, whatever it is, that works for you and enables you to be able to express yourself through that form of art or academics or whatever it turns out to be, that just enables you to go forward. I think music would be another even more intense and concentrated on dance. Something that just has to happen. And once you set it in motion, it sort of has its own life. And I think that's why there are all kinds of ways to move on. MoveOn.org. That's all. As you can tell, I'm a very long-winded person. A simple question with a long answer.
Thanks.
Yes, dear?
Yeah, and the film documents in some ways the way that the relationships in your life have been nourished by taking photographs and making films, including the relationship with your son. Mm-hmm. And it also documents the way in which as a parent, you experience his use of media as a block on communication or on relationships. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about whether filming those two things together enabled you to see his use of media in a different way, and also what you think the difference between today's digital media are and film and photography in terms of relationality.
Well, you're opening the floodgates for me. Well, no, the film hints at a direction. I mean, you could write a dissertation on this whole subject. I'm sure many of you are. I'd like to think that making the film has enabled us to come together, but there's still a lot of friction. He actually travels with me usually to present the film. He could speak for himself if he were here. But, he was still in Virginia at the last screening and lingered there for several days, so he's not here now. But I think he, in a way, celebrates the difference between the two technologies. I'm definitely the analog world, he's the digital world, and he thinks a lot of what I do is fairly old school. But he also knows that there's something to it because you get something done, and he's very anxious to, it's, what we were talking about, very anxious to get to that point where he too can get something done. So it's a very complicated subject when I try to compare the two worlds. I mean, it's always easy to look back at generations and say things were better then. And, I refuse to do that. I mean, I think his generation is discovering a different way of communicating in the world, and that's very, very important to do. And yet I sort of still think there's something to be said for looking carefully at the world and trying to absorb the details and the surprises that it offers, and to have the patience and to invest the time. That's the one thing none of us have anymore is time. And when I went to France, I created a situation where I had to be there for 30 days shooting. It was not in Paris, it was like far, far away. It was a train ride plus a long bus ride to get to this village. And it forced me to go back to that world in a way, logistically, where I didn't even have Wi-Fi. I had to go to a cafe to communicate. There was nothing, And I think it's very hard for us to find that kind of isolation that enables us to focus now. And that's why making this film was an attraction to me. It was in two ways enabled me to, I had to give what I got in 30 days because there was not enough in my budget to go back to France and shoot more if I had to. So I think that Adrian, my son, and the digital generation, everything is immediately accessible, everything can immediately be put out there for the world, and I think put out there to the world through the internet. And I think it's harder for them to have this experience of finishing, creating something, and getting a response to it, and moving on. I mean, it's just, I'm not sure that I've answered your question. In fact, I'm not even sure what your question was. But if you don't stop me, I'll keep babbling for over another hour. But it's, it's very, very complex. I think I feel closer to him. I think there's still friction between us. But part of that is the friction that one feels when, your father has his career and you don't yet have yours. And I felt that too with my father, as I say in the film. So I'm sympathetic, but it does make it hard sometimes. Yes, you got a simple question for me?
I don't know. How does your decision to go to France to make a film and your decision to go to France to learn more about your son and how you were when you were at that age, how do those things interact? Like, is the trip to, or are they separate at all, I guess is the question.
Well, I think they're vaguely integrated in some way. But I think my main reason to go back to France was to try to find these people. And I wouldn't pretend otherwise. I think it's kind of a narrative device that I'm also thinking about what I was like at that age. But de facto, that's what I have to be doing when I go back, because I haven't been back in all those years, and I was that age when I was there last. And so for me, I'm looking at this place through two sets of eyes. The eyes of me as a 24-year-old, and the eyes of me much, much later. I won't tell you how old. But it's, I kept thinking about my son. I think maybe as a filmmaker, I realized this was a narrative device that I had to pay attention to, and so I went through the trouble of setting up the camera when I Skyped him, for instance. Maybe I would not have done that if that had been a thing. I might have Skyped him, I might have been in touch with him. but I would not necessarily film it. But because I thought of it as a possible narrative strand for the film, I realized I had to cover it just in case I did decide to use it for that. So from that perspective, it was fairly self-conscious that pursuing that particular career. I think it's possible. I could have made the film just about my journey back to France, and in fact, that was my original intention. But somehow I was hoping that a richer, more complex experience might be rendered in film if I also somehow connected it to him. Does that answer your question? Yeah, that's right. Yes?
I have one. And it's interesting to me because so much of this, I mean, aside from the structure of it, is a film and your own method in terms of making films, and they're being so largely autobiographical. What strikes me often in watching something like this is not just the kind of love any parent feels for their child, which leads to the very frustration you're talking about, but in this particular work, because you're talking about your child, there are actually additional characters in your family. I suspect somebody from the outside would say that the camera itself is like the unspoken sibling who's always there. And the absence of your wife, and I suspect she doesn't want to be part of this, but by her very absence, she's a huge part of this, as any mother is to their children. So in some ways, it's a funny kind of incompleteness, and I just wondered if you could comment on it a little bit. And it's not that I feel that people should always be included in films, but the fact that you're looking at an intense psychological familial situation is striking.
Right, no, you're absolutely correct, and my wife did decline to be filmed for this particular project for her own reasons. And I think, you know, to totally be honest with you, we're now divorced, but it has nothing to do with my having made the film. It's just, there were problems in my personal life that started many years ago, and I think by the time I started this particular project, she had declined to be part of the film, even though part of the film was about her son. She knew I was doing that. She also knew I was going to be friends, and all of that was very open. But and so it's a discernible absence, and actually, it's kind of remarkable that you raise it because almost nobody has. And yeah, I know. And maybe it's a matter of being a parent and being married. I would assume maybe you have children and you have families. So you know, from people who aren't, it doesn't really occur to them. And I think for people who are married and wonder what about the mother's role in this, that they draw their own conclusions, but there are limits to what you can do as an essay filmmaker. And I think that was too difficult for me to go to. Other filmmakers would have said, you know, I'll attack this as a theme and it'll become relevant to the film I'm making now, and it'll be even stronger. And possibly the film would have been stronger if I dealt with it. I couldn't go there. I just could not go there. So you're addressing something that's palpably valid. I mean, it's definitely an absence in the film, and it's just a personal, psychological, and study decision I made, not to try to deal with that in that movie. You know, maybe in the next film, a couple of years down the road, when I've got some distance from it all. The divorce has been fairly recent, so. You know, it also puts me in a strange situation because one of the reasons I'm here is because I've made this series of films that deal, you know, with a lot of things, public issues and political issues, lives of friends, but also family, the notion of family. And suddenly I find myself without a family, and that's, or at least not the family I had. In consulting or addressing that reconfiguration as a filmmaker has left me not knowing what to do next. Yeah, Tim.
Yeah, I was having to follow up on that. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this film in relationship to your earlier films. There's obviously a lot of structural and thematic connections with family and different time zones that one's dealing with, and just the relationship to media, to photographs, to film, and how that comes into play in dealing with the past and the present and so forth. But I was thinking as I was watching this with, you know, what you said about there's often a kind of public and even political dimension to some of the earlier films, even in a parodic way, with Sherman's March and Bright Leaves and the Hollywood film and so forth. This seems like a much more sort of intensely personal film. And I think of the one shot in this film, which is really quite moving, particularly for me, where you're filming yourself in the camera and you're saying, I'm getting old. That way. And did you feel like this was in some ways, as it sort of extends some of the issues that you've always been dealing with, it becomes more sort of intensely personal in this?
Well, my hope is to always be able to make films that might have some autobiographical underpinning, but at least aren't purely about me. I don't think it'd be very interesting. So it always has to be about other things as well in the world. And this is really the first film where there isn't a salient political issue in which I'm also exploring, like, nuclear weapons proliferation or big tobacco or, corrosive effects of media, television media, news broadcasting in our culture. And so for me, it was a little risky to do this, and yet I felt the most external issue I could address would be the digital age and the generation gap between the analog and digital generations. So, and yet, it didn't make it easier for me to sort of weave my own story. And somehow I think it was just because at this particular juncture in my life, I don't know what my story is anymore, to be honest. It's really, I'm in a little bit of a dilemma as a filmmaker. But I'll figure it out, I'm sure. Yes?
Actually, to just pick up what Jerry and Tim were talking about, actually I saw you at West Virginia at the Colloquium, and you were showing a lot of your older films, and you were showing some of Time Indefinite, and
Sure.
The first time I had seen it, actually, a friend of mine had recommended it to me after my father died, as a way of kind of help, find some kind of connection. And this isn't so much a question as, I guess, a statement that, or maybe a question in a way, that you realize that your autobiographical films are actually part of a broader collective memory at this point, because you've been making films for a while. And so there's a connections. I'm like, that I missed your wife's presence as well, right? It's almost as like they're a part of it. I'm then looking at your son, and I'm like, oh man, you've grown up, because I remember when you went, but I don't know if you've come a long way. But I do, and I'm just like, has that ever occurred to you that it's like, it's not just autobiographical, that it's not like, that it is a part of maybe a broader society?
I'm painfully aware of that.
Oh.
Eventually, I will figure out how to make that turn. And I do understand that people will see the Time Indefinite out of it. I mean, I have some amazing emails and letters that were sent to me about that particular film. That it just meant a lot to individuals who are going through things. I mean, it's, what's your story? Time Indefinite, for those of you who haven't seen it, has to do with the death of my father and the birth of my son. And it's, in some ways, it's the most, it's where I really kind of investigate raw emotions very directly, I guess you could say. Because my father died very suddenly and unpredictably from a heart attack. He was still working, he was in great shape, and just dropped dead. And it was a total shock. And I was in the middle of making a film. So Time Indefinite deals with those serious issues. And at a certain point, I just know I have to move on and make the next film, and it will fit where it fits in the continuum. And maybe some people don't like the new films as much as they like the old films, but I can't do anything about that.
It seems like you're investigating the idea of memory itself and how to constitute it in some way, in some kind of coherent way.
The older you get, the more memory there is, and that's going to become increasingly something I've got to contemplate in my films. And there's also an archive going with all of this too, which represents memory in a way. And so that's going to become, I just refuse to live in the past. I won't go there. I won't be a nostalgic filmmaker. Yet there's a lot of nostalgia in this movie. So, but if I hadn't been able to track down Ellen and Maud, I think the film would have been far less interesting. The fact that they're real and alive and the film present is presented in this movie makes a huge difference. Thank God I was able to actually find it. Because I think otherwise the film would have dwelt totally in the past. Tim, go ahead. Just let me know as far as how we're doing with time.
Okay.
But yes, go
I was
ahead.
just curious, I was thinking about the way that your son is sort of using technology and how that was sometimes something that was very difficult to get through to him with those sort of devices in the way. And I'm wondering how you think about your use of a camera and,
Of course.
and through your children's full, growing up and yeah.
It's highly ironic that I complain about my son and his technology. I'm sticking a camera in his face. And, actually it had something in the narration at one point. I wrote something about that. I guess I shouldn't complain because, I've been doing this for years to him and now he's doing it to me. And what's my fault? But I took the narration out because I thought it was really kind of embedded into the film and didn't need to be said overtly. But yes, I think who knows what the outcome of that influence will be on Adrian, but it's bound to have some influence. And it's not also, it seems in my movies as if I'm filming all the time. And clearly I'm filming about 0.5% our waking hours. All the other time I'm just being with him, being with the camera. It's exaggerated somewhat for comic effect, narrative effect and so forth. But still, it is true that a lot of his life is preserved on film, and that's turned up in movies that have been seen by a lot of people. So how does that affect him? He mostly seems to use it as a kind of fuel to advance his own desires to be successful in media. He does go to all these festivals with me and appearances and talks to audiences afterwards. And he's been interviewed by the press separately. So if you want to know the answer to how he feels about it, ask him. He talks to journalists. So there's a way in which he's embraced the experience, but I think there are also ways in which it's got to be hard. I didn't have to deal with that. My father, fortunately, was a surgeon. He wasn't filming me all the time. So there's a way in which I'm doing surgery with a camera on my son, and it's that a kind of autopsy? I hope not. But he would have a kind of valid stance and he can always say no. That's the other thing. He can always say, I don't want to be filmed. But he doesn't. He doesn't. He's always sort of quasi up for it.
Ross, I particularly enjoy the movie. Also, the way in which it is built is also kind of thriller because, in fact, there is a citation of Sherlock Holmes. You put the clues and you try to understand. I think I was waiting to see more. What's going to reveal more. But there is a moment then. So it's built as a kind of thriller, mystery kind of movie. But then the mystery is not satisfied because Mo decide not to be camera anymore. There are a few seconds in which the camera goes off. The question is, if you want to share with us, do you learn, because we are intrigued by what is the reality. She remembers that she left you, remember that you left her, and that we don't ever know the truth there. But if you can share with us, do you understand more the moment in which the camera goes off? If there was about what exactly happened. So what exactly happened?
I will never tell you. After that, it was incredible.
Mystery scared.
Je t'ai perdu, parler to No, what I said is a compressed version of exactly what happened. And I was also, I was stumbling with my French while also trying to remember depth of field with my camera, and I couldn't pursue it very much, but insofar as she was willing to talk about it, basically she held to the point of view that my recollections were inaccurate. In fact, she remembered that we did a romantic thing. She doesn't remember us being lovers. I remember us being lovers. And so who's right? Maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I just imagined the whole thing. Maybe I was a romance-stunned American wandering around France, fantasizing on things that never happened. I guess it's possible, but I don't think so, because other things I remember about that period are very, I've been subsequently proved true, so I think, but that's really not the point factually. This isn't a piece of journalism, it's a kind of meditation. And I think one of the things I'm meditating on is the accuracy of memory and the way memory of your real life fictionalizes itself over time. So, who knows? Maud has had a rough life. I think she was drinking a lot at one point. One of her husbands, I think, had problems with drug addiction, she told me. And I think, you know, she may have just gone through periods where, frankly, she doesn't remember everything that happened in her youth. And you know, it could be that she honestly thinks that what I say in this version of the film is true, or maybe she just didn't feel like revealing it on camera because she wanted to guard her reputation for village. I can't imagine why anybody would care one way or the other. But that's the story I got, and you know, if I had been a different kind of filmmaker, I guess I would have picked the camera up and continued to press her on it.
Well, it sounds very nice.
Yeah, and I think, that's not, I don't, the filmmaking gestalt to do that, and it's just not part of my DNA. And so I just accepted that. It's in a way kind of giving up a little bit too easily, you know. If I really sort of wanted to know more, why didn't I come back the next day and continue the conversation? But I didn't. You know. I was also on a sort of limited time frame. I only had 30 days and I wanted to get my story.
Yeah, I just found Helen just totally great, and I just have this experience of seeing your films, and usually there's a character who just pops out, and it's just all the more extraordinary, particularly since it seems as if you didn't remember her as much. And what I loved about her was the gusto, but also it seems as if how she really thought about being interviewed in the film as a creative process in how she thought that about her contributions. And when she started talking about herself as Sherlock Holmes and then corrects herself as Watson, and just the obvious enjoyment she has in being on filmed and following the whole process and just becoming a character. So I just wanted to know if you could talk about this interviewing people and whether or not you think they see their participation as interview subjects as a form of creativity, and in general, and if this has changed also now that media has become more participatory with developments and people being perhaps more used to speaking into a camera as a kind of creativity itself and not just being interviewed.
Well, I think it's absolutely true what you say about people much more accustomed to the notion of real life providing an opportunity to become a temporary star. And that's what reality TV is voiced upon our culture, or given our culture, from any point of view. YouTube, the internet, everything else. Ellen was totally in a different world. She wasn't living a primitive existence by any means, but I don't think she even had cable television. She had a TV set and a DVD player. She did watch video, but this came naturally to her. And there are people like that in the world. And another person like that is Charlene, who's in many of my films. I think she's got that same spark. I don't know where that comes from. But as a documentary filmmaker, when you go out there and start filming people, it's clear that some people have this gift or this lack of self-consciousness or I guess, an ability to simply be themselves, but in a narratively entertaining way. And Ellen turned out to be one of these people. I had no idea that she was going to be that way. I didn't even know if I'd find her. And I was incredibly lucky that she was like that, because everybody has the same response. How did you find this woman? She's great. And I think, you know, she's seen the film. It was broadcast in French. She saw it, and I think she was a little embarrassed, but she also really kind of got off on the fact that she was seen by, millions of people in France. And she likes that, you know. So, and I think that's part of it too, is that you have a certain confidence in yourself as a presence in front of the camera, so that you're not insecure, you're not worried about what your presentation of yourself is going to be. If you know, Charlene is one of those people, when she makes a mistake or says something ridiculous or absurd, she just accepts it and laughs about it. And Ellen is the same way, I think, and who knows why people are like that. As a documentary filmmaker, you know, first of all, I don't really think about interviews because I don't have my set of questions to ask her, and I don't do pre-interviews, and I don't rehearse those kinds of things. So interviews are a little bit too formal a way to think about it. I really think more of it as a kind of conversation that happens as I wander and I'm filming other things in the house, and then I say, you know, I have this photo book, I'm going to show it to you, and actually there's one person here I'm curious about. And that was the first time she had made that connection. She'd flipped through the book before, but I don't think she thought about who Maud was or noticed her or commented on it. She certainly didn't comment to me about it. And this time I really asked her, and specifically said that was the moment where she first realized this is the moment that my husband knew. And I think that if I had filmed take 2 of that, or if I'd been through that before with her, it wouldn't have been as good. Something would not have worked as well as it works in the film. And that's, you know, what I do is hardly pure cinema verite. I mean, I'm talking to people from behind the camera, which you never do in pure cinema verite. The filmmaker is part of the narrative action, and, you know, in many ways it's not cinema verite, but in some ways it still is. And one of those parts of that approach to filmmaking that I still embrace is the fact that you capture it at that moment or you just don't get it. And I think if you're lucky enough to find the kind of people that can help you pull that off, as I was with that, then so much the better. But that's how I guess I answer the question. What you've already had.
I haven't, so someone else.
If nobody else has a question, then Mr. ADD can answer.
Thank you.
But don't ask me the same question.
I won't ask the same question. Try to keep it short and organized. Yeah, I've just, since I saw Sherman's March, which I saw all your films just in the last year, but I've been dying to ask you this. You know, so I'm a newspaper reporter, and I also do some radio reporting for 6 years now, and so I would like to think I'm better than the average person at getting in someone's face and sort of making them talk to me and recording it and forcing that to happen. But I still find myself very shy. I mean, I think everybody does. It's still hard to do. I still get shy when I knock on a door, and I still am kind of wimpy when people say, "Oh, don't write that." You know, don't put, or could you edit that out? You know, and sometimes you must have come up with some sort of philosophy or trick that lets you keep that camera in those uncomfortable, intensely personal moments. And I wonder.
Yeah, well, my cardinal rule is that people ask me not to film, I don't film. Like when Mom says put the camera in, I put it down.
Right.
You know, because, I mean, it's not just purely an altruistic or an ethical stance, because obviously you're not going to get better material if you keep filming. I mean, you'll get in some kind of a conflict, and then that'll be the end of your filming. So what good does that do you? It doesn't do you once you get involved. It certainly doesn't help that person. But, you know, more, I think it's just human decency is a huge part of it, where you just don't force yourself on people journalistically. Well, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, but aren't there times when you yourself think, oh gosh, maybe I should just, you know, stop filming for a minute because you're affected by what they're saying, or because you see someone exposing themselves in some way?
Sometimes. I mean, the world never ceases to amaze me in terms of how people will say and do things that you think you'd keep to yourself. No, I think, you know, I suspect you have the right instincts as a journalist. You know, you don't seem like, I mean, I don't know you, but you don't seem like the kind of person who would be assaulted in your journalism. And there are those people out there. I mean, just tune in Fox News any day of the week. There it is in spades. And there's a place for that kind of journalism. You know, one of the things I did last weekend in Virginia was I saw a screening of All the President's Men, the Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman film. And they actually brought in, and for those of you who don't know, All the President's Men is about the Watergate scandal back in '72, and for those of you who don't know that, it's basically the lying and scheming that President Richard Nixon did in order to avoid, in order to win the Republican presidential race that year. I'm sorry, in order to win the presidency, he was the Republican nominee. And there was a burglary in the Democratic National Party headquarters in Washington, D.C. It seemed totally unconnected to anything that was happening in terms of the national campaign. And then slowly, these two reporters from the Washington Post started following their hunches about what was important and basically put together facts and clues and so forth, and they kept getting just enough support from Benjamin Bradley, who was the editor of the Post, to keep going. And basically, they ended up compiling a case against not only Nixon, his entire cabinet, most of his advisors, his closest consultants, and it forced Nixon to resign. it was quite extraordinary. And this was a huge event in journalism and inspired an entire generation of people to go into journalism. They were incredibly aggressive. They were always polite, and I noticed this from the film. They would always say, "Sir," to the people they were talking to. One other question, "Sir, would you care to comment? Someone else has said this about you. We just would like to know your comment." And, John Mitchell, the Attorney General at the time, got furious on the phone. He started screaming at them at one point. But they always said, "Sir." They were always polite. They didn't force them beyond a certain point. So there was that built into their approach, and it really got them far. They had a kind of humility about what they were doing. They were both young reporters at that time. And they knew that humility actually was not a bad approach to take as a journalist, and I think it got them very far. Also they were very smart, and they were very determined, they were very ambitious, so all of that played a role. What was really interesting about that evening, by the way, was that Carl Bernstein and Woodward actually came to the screening and then talked about it afterwards. And that was fascinating because, they're in their 60s now, back when they were in their 20s. So for me, it was a little bit like photographic memory. Watching these two Hollywood stars play them in this very successful film, which I think won a bunch of Academy Awards that year. And they won a Pulitzer Prize for the reporting they'd done for the Post, and all of it was kind of celebrated together in this big screening. They were very humble about what their mission was, and yet I think they weren't restrained, but they were gracious and polite about how to go about their business. I don't know how far they get you these days, but it worked out. It's still very true. I'm of that generation.
Question over there? I think over there there's a question.
I want to ask if making this movie has changed your relationship with your own biographical past. Yes, how? And was it supposed? You start your work exploring the relationship with your son, but after a while it focused very much on you, on yourself somehow, or at least this is the feeling I had. So what was maybe done by purpose to, maybe bury some past, or I don't know. I want to ask if after finishing the movie, your relationship with your own biographical past have changed.
When you say my photographical past?
Biographical.
I'm sorry?
Biographical.
Biographical. Oh. Are you saying, does the film itself change my conception of my own biographical past?
Well, for sure, the whole going back to France, looking for these people who has played a role in your life, finding out that maybe something you were remembering in one way, the other person who has shared the experience with you remembered other ways. I don't know, it looks like there is something that gets you there before you start to explore the relationship with your son. There is something more at the core. I don't know, just wondering.
Well, part of my biography, my identity, is to be a documentary filmmaker, and the documentary filmmaker uses his own life as a component in making his films. So that's always a motivation for me to think about whatever it is I'm filming in that context. I'm not sure I'm totally understanding the question, but I think, are you saying that maybe there's too much of my biography in my film?
No, I was asking, I'm sorry, I was not really, if maybe...
Your English is better than my French, just saying.
Oh, I don't think so. I speak a little French. But somehow I was asking if your past was challenging you before this movie, and well, if you needed as an inner need to somehow to challenge your past.
Well, I think it was really driven more by not a need to challenge my past, but just a deep curiosity about it. So some of it has to do with reaching a certain age. And I don't think I had to prove to myself that something about my past either was true or wasn't true, or was one way or not another way. I think it was just simple curiosity, and I don't think I was particularly looking to score a specific empirical point about the relevancy of the truth of what I remember of my past being. I don't know if that's a sufficient answer to your question, but that's the best I would put it. I mean, I wasn't really trying to prove something was either true or not true. That really wasn't.
No, I don't mean, I was not asking this, but just say, when you get back, did you look to your past in a different way or not?
The past concerning the film or my past?
Your biographical past, the years spent in France, and so how this affects your...
Well, no, I think once I make the film, I just decide, well, that's it. There's nothing but the future now. Of course, the thing about the future is it's always becoming the past, so that means I got to get on to the next film as soon as possible before it goes stale and I can't remember anything about it.
Maybe one more question.
You mentioned being surprised about some of the things people will say that they maybe should keep to themselves.
Myself included.
I'm curious how you feel, what kind of responsibility you feel to a person who's revealing something you think they might not want to reveal while you're shooting them.
Well, one thing I do is I show cuts of the film, or the final version of the film before I release it, to people who are really essential to the film. Like I showed my son an even longer version of the film, which had everything that's in this movie, plus other stuff, and asked him, is there anything in here you don't like? Because if so, tell me now, because later it'll be too late. And basically he approved everything that was in that longer version, which means everything that he's seen in here, he also approved of. But it's very easy to show someone a DVD version of the film with just the two of you watching it, and it'll seem fairly harmless, and then of course what is going to happen is it goes out in the world and other people will write things about it and respond to it in certain ways, and it's a totally different experience. So in a way that's not a totally, it doesn't totally take care of the problem. And I think all documentary filmmakers go through this, and I think for more agenda-oriented documentary films, the filmmakers have to decide that it's simply more important to have, like Inside Job, I think is a perfect example of that. You have some very high-placed people in academia, the Ivy League included, who say absurdly condemning, self-condemning things about the university's connections to big business in a way that's shocking. It's something I had never thought about. I teach in one of these places, and that was a revelation to me. Those people hung themselves. The Dean of Columbia just said absurd things, and but I think the people from Inside Job, when they were making that film, realized this is going to be very damning when it comes out. And yet, for whatever reason, the Dean of Columbia, the Dean of Columbia allowed, or maybe it's the business school, I can't remember exactly what it was, but allowed, he signed a release, and he said, use whatever you want. The interview that we just had, it's like 45 minutes out of his day. What does he care? He does 100 of these every year, and he forgot, he didn't realize, and then it came out in the film, and I'm sure he was mortified by the way his statements, his beliefs were put up there on a big screen. So even though the filmmakers had a wonderfully genial relationship with him while they were filming, even though they got his official permission in the form of the signed release, ultimately it was a totally different experience when that comes out in the world. That is an example of the ways in which, as a filmmaker, you sort of know more than your subject does often about what's going to happen in a film. I will say that in Sherman's March, for instance, this film I made about a number of eccentric people, including myself, in the South, back in the mid-'80s, that there were points where I just did not put certain scenes in the film because I realized they were just too damning to the people whom I was filming. There was one woman in particular who, I just couldn't bring myself to put the scenes in that I filmed with her permission. They were just absurd, so I cut those. And that's where I was just making a decision. Again, it wasn't totally altruistic. I realized it will become a parody of, and sort of caustic documentary, if I keep this kind of material in film, that's not going to ultimately benefit the film. So it's always a complicated decision process.
I want to end by thanking Alexis for being one of the prime movers in this event and urge you all to go to the Tiger Asteroid.
Does everybody know about this event? Alexis?
Yes, we announced it.
It's on the board, yes.
Yeah.
Till December 15th.
Yeah, so please support that. Thank you, Alexis. And of course, I want to thank Nicola Gentili, who is the mastermind behind most everything we do in cinema studies here. And thank you especially, Ross, for coming down. Thank you very much.
It's almost been like a giant group therapy session.